Colonel! Colonel, I must know what you think has been going on here.
Life as a non-believer is actually pretty good. It's not as scary as the religious people make it out to be. And in fact, it can be liberating and exhilarating. You have a different outlook on life. You no longer think that you're going to live forever with Jesus in heaven or whatever. You won't be reunited with your deceased loved ones, but you find ways of coping with that. There's an upside to it, too. You're no longer always struggling against all the contradictions in your religious dogma. You're no longer having to rationalize away why God hasn't answered your prayers. You can now face reality more honestly.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Trolling with Logic, where we bring the hammer down on pseudoscience, ignorance, and unreason on a bi-weekly basis. I am your host, Nathan Dickey, and with me, as always, are co-hosts Cal and Jen. How are you guys doing?
I'm doing fantastic.
I'm pretty sleepy. I've climbed a mountain today, so I'm pretty knackered, but good. Very good.
Nice. Well, today we are thrilled to be joined by Dr. John C. Wathey. Dr. Wathey is a computational biologist with special research interests in evolutionary algorithms, protein folding, and neuroethology. From 91 to 95, Dr. Wathey served as senior applications scientist at Biosim Technologies, a company that develops molecular modeling software for the pharmaceutical industry. In 96, he founded his own company, Wathey Research, and most of his scientific research there has been funded by grants from the National Institutes of Health. He is the author of a book that came out last year called The Illusion of God's Presence, The Biological Origins of Spiritual Longing, and he joins us on the show to discuss the questions raised in this book about what our evolutionary heritage can teach us about the nature of religious belief. Welcome to the show, Dr. Wathey.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure and an honor.
To kick things off, can you tell us a little about where you're coming from as far as your research interests go and what prompted you to write this book?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I did my PhD at UC San Diego in the lab of Ted Bullock, who is he's considered one of the founding fathers of neuroethology. And ethology, as some of your listeners will probably already know, is the study of animal behavior in its natural context. Ethologists are mainly interested in things like how does the behavior evolve, how does it contribute to an animal's reproductive success. And they often look at behaviors that occur in newly hatched or newly born animals where there's not been a whole lot of time for learning, and that's where you're most likely to see something where evolution has shaped the behavior. So that's ethology. Neuroethology is a branch of neuroscience where we're trying to understand how some particular circuit in the brain works. And it's easiest to do that if you can find an animal that's highly specialized for one peculiar, unusual behavior. For example, things like infrared vision in rattlesnakes, or the electric sense in nucleoelectric fish, or song learning in birds. All of those things are highly specialized, and they're the kinds of things you can easily measure in the laboratory. It's pretty obvious what problem the animal is trying to solve. So that gives you a nice way into the brain to try to figure out how the brain is solving this problem, if you know what the problem is to begin with. So that's where I come from. That's my background. And when I was in Ted's lab many years ago, this was some odd years ago now, it really kind of changed the way I thought about all living things, not just experimental animals, but humans too. And I began to see human religious behavior through this lens of neuroethology. I could see something in religion that I thought most of the scientific literature on religion had been ignoring, and I started to fantasize about writing a book about it someday. And it wasn't until many years later that I finally actually sat down and wrote the book. But that's where it came from. That's how I got this thing forming in my brain that I eventually had to put out into the form of a book.
When I first heard the topic, it's a bit of a new, that there's a biological underpinning to religious belief, if I'm picking you up right, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, so what are you basing this on? I'm very curious. This is something I've never heard before.
Yeah, I'm actually surprised how many people have not heard it and how many people kind of push back against it a little bit. Some people, and it's not just religious people who push back against it. I've had some pushback from scientists, skeptics, or humanists even. There's a very common perception that religion comes entirely from indoctrination. It's a cultural thing. We know, for example, that a person's religious denomination is almost entirely predicted or highly predicted by the religious denomination of their parents. So all of this strongly suggests that there's a big component of learning, culture, and indoctrination in religion. So how can this be biological? But there are two big lines of evidence that say that there is something biological going on here. One is just the obvious fact that religion is a cultural universal. Every human culture has something that most of us would recognize as religion or sort of proto-religion. And the other line of evidence comes from twin studies. If religion came only from environment and learning and indoctrination, then we would expect that pairs of identical twins would be no more alike in their religiousness than are pairs of fraternal twins. Fraternal twins have half of their genes in common. Identical twins have 100% of their genes in common. But that shouldn't make any difference if religion comes from something that's not at least partly genetic. So that's something you can test. And people have done that test. And when we do twin studies of religiousness in adulthood, we find that there is a significant genetic contribution to the tendency to be religious. Identical twins are much more alike in their degree of religiousness as adults than are fraternal twins. And in fact, the difference is so great that about roughly 40 to 50% of the variance in religiousness comes from genetic factors. So that's the evidence for it. The idea that I'm putting forward in the book has to do with a specific dimension of religiousness. There is a big, wide streak of infantilism in religion. Not all of religion is this. This is just, like I said, one dimension of religion. But there is, for example, a strong tendency to see God as a superparent, this parental figure who loves us and cares for us and responds to our prayers in the same way that a mother would respond to a newborn or young infant crying for help. And you see this over and over again in religious literature and symbolism and ritual and songs. I have a whole chapter about that in the book. And so that's where I had my jumping off point. That's the aspect of religion I most try to explain. And I think that comes from something innate. It's very much along the lines of imprinting in animals. It's very closely tied to something that psychologists have studied called attachment theory. But there's a new wrinkle in it, which is I emphasize the part that is innate. And the central hypothesis of the book is that there is this innate model of a mother that every human newborn is born with. It's kind of an expectation in their brain that there exists this other being out there who is loving and nurturing and powerful and responsive to cries for help. That's pretty much the essence of it. And just having that hardwired into an infant's brain shapes the way the infant will learn to interact with its mother and then its father and other people as it becomes a social animal. So that's kind of it in a nutshell.
With the twins, with the genetically identical twins, as opposed to was it fraternal twins?
Yes.
How do you account for that being a genetic trait rather than a socially pressured trait? Because twins that I know who are identical twins, they feel, or they seem to feel or experience or promote a sense of wanting to be the same in many different ways because they look the same, because they identify with each other a lot more closely than fraternal twins do. How do you account for that and say that it's not that's actually pressuring them to think the same way in terms of their religion rather than something genetic?
Well, there are several different ways of doing twin studies, and the easiest one is ones where you just look at twins who are raised together. That's the easiest because most twins are raised together. But there's another experimental design of the twin study, where you examine twins who were separated at birth and raised apart. Those are harder to find, but there are people in Minnesota who've done a great deal of work on this and have tracked down a great many pairs of twins who were separated at birth because the twins were put up for adoption. And when you do those studies, you find the same thing. You find the same effect, that identical twins are significantly more alike in their religiousness than fraternal twins, even when the pairs of twins are raised apart. So that kind of shoots down that argument.
Okay.
Getting into the meat of your hypothesis about why most believers experience this sense of God's presence, there's a relevant quote from the Christian philosopher and apologist William Lane Craig that I think your hypothesis might go some way towards explaining what's going on, and I'll include the audio clip. What he has stated is this.
My view here is that the way in which I know Christianity is true is first and foremost on the basis of the witness of the Holy Spirit in my heart, and that this gives me a self-authenticating means of knowing that Christianity is true wholly apart from the evidence. And therefore, if in some historically contingent circumstances the evidence that I have available to me should turn against Christianity, I don't think that controverts the witness of the Holy Spirit.
Your hypothesis, if correct, may go some ways towards explaining why Craig feels this spiritual witness in his heart, yes?
Yes, exactly. What he's talking about is exactly the kind of thing I'm trying to explain. And you often find when you debate with someone like Craig, who is a Christian apologist, the debate will often start out with things like the traditional arguments for the existence of God. You need some kind of intelligent magical being to get the universe started. And we don't even need to go through them. You know them. They're all kind of these logical rationalizations for why there must be a God. Mm-hmm. The argument for design is another one. But most of those can be fairly easily shot down. And as you shoot them down one after another, the fallback position of the Christian apologist almost always ends up being what you just quoted Craig saying, which is, well, yeah, okay, you can win on all these other arguments, but you can never convince me that this feeling I have in my heart isn't real. I know there is this being out there because I just sense it. I feel it, and I know it must be true. And end of story, end of argument for them. My point is, that feeling is real. I don't deny the feeling. I'm pretty sure it's real. I've actually felt it myself, even after becoming an atheist. But there's a perfectly, completely natural explanation for where those feelings come from. And that's what I try to explain in the book. And like I said, my hypothesis is that we're born with this innate model of a mother. The brain is expecting an all-powerful, loving, nurturing, saving being to be out there. And it's the thing that gets the infant side of mother-infant attachment started. And for some reason, and we can speculate about that later, but for some reason, I'm arguing it persists into adulthood, but in kind of a dormant state. This neural circuitry is there, but it's just not normally used. But if you get into a situation where you're feeling helpless and under great stress, some really terrible low point in your life where you've really hit rock bottom and you're desperate, you're depressed, you're maybe a drug addict or whatever it is, suddenly you're in a state of mind that's very akin to being a helpless infant. And this circuit can be activated, and when it is, you suddenly have this feeling of this loving, nurturing, vague being that's out there somewhere. And all you need to do is reach out, cry out for help, and you'll be saved. And this fits so nicely with certain aspects of religious doctrine that you very easily plug the Virgin Mary or Jesus or Allah or whatever it happens to be into that God-shaped vacuum or God-shaped hole, as it's often called. So that's what I think is going on with Craig when he's talking about that.
So, in a way, this could explain the foxhole atheist thing that's very popular with some apologists.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's where that argument comes from. That when you're in a really desperate, life-threatening situation, like in a foxhole being shot at, you're going to have this kind of feeling that there must be a God that can save me from this, because you're suddenly desperately helpless.
If you're in that kind of a position, sort of a desperate position in your life, and you don't have that feeling, what does that say? Because I mean, I have been, as regular listeners of the show probably know, and people who know me on social media, I've been through some pretty bizarre and kind of depressing things in my past, including homelessness. And when I was homeless, when I was sleeping rough, also when I was a drug addict, I never had that sort of sense of somebody being there, some sort of sense of something else being there. However, there was one program that some Christians in Exeter ran, where they would offer a roof over your head if you were within a certain age range. And one time I stayed with this elderly lady, and she was very nice. She fed me tea and all that kind of stuff, and she talked to me a little bit about her belief. And the way that she described God to me was, to me, thought. It was the way she was thinking. It was the good thoughts that she had. It was her basically almost, well, not scapegoating, that's not the right word, but basically saying that her thoughts, the good things that she did and the good things that she thought and the good intuition that she had and the things that she wanted to do for other people, that was God, that was God speaking and trying to sort of promote things via her. And yeah, I'm just wondering, for somebody such as myself, who doesn't believe they've ever had that sensation, despite having been through some pretty desperate times, what is that saying about us? What is that saying about something that we perhaps lack that other people have experienced?
The first thing I would say about that is that this kind of thing is something that varies across the population. Some people have more of this tendency than others. It may be stronger in some people than others. There's a lot of evidence that it's stronger in women than in men on average. Why it's not particularly strong in you in particular, I can't say, except that like with any heritable trait, it's something that varies across the population, and you may be one of those who just has a little of it and not very much, and it's just not enough to kick in when you reached rock bottom as you did.
Difficult to trigger.
Yeah.
Well, you talk about the image of God as loving and nurturing and infinitely compassionate. One very important aspect of your book that addresses the other side of this God image. We often hear Christians, for example, particularly fundamentalist believers, say things like, well, our God is a God of love and kindness, but he is also a God of justice who will not tolerate straying from his will. Why this dual model of God with two conflicting dimensions to his personality?
Great question. And this is one of the questions I get most often when I talk to people about this idea or about the book. Religious people tend to have a contradictory, incoherent vision of God or image of God as kind of a two-faced being. God is powerful, strong, and judgmental. He's going to separate the good from the evil, reward the righteous and punish and condemn the wicked. And there's a heaven for the holy and a hell for the bad folks. So there's that aspect. It's all punishment and sacrifice. This punishing God is also always demanding costly sacrifice as proof of your belief and your loyalty. Okay, that's one side. And the other side is the one we were talking about earlier, which is this sort of motherly image of God as all nurturing, loving, protecting, saving, and always responsive to prayers. The amazing thing is that it's very easy to find people who have both of those images of God simultaneously, even though they're completely contradictory, even though they contradict one another. So why is this? This is a profound puzzle and to me a fascinating puzzle. Why is this? And I think the reason is that there are really two biological sources of religion, two heritable things in the brain that give rise to religion, and they're kind of distinct from one another, although they interact in interesting places. One is the innate model of the mother we were talking about earlier that gives rise to the infantile aspects of religion and the image of a loving God. The other is what I call the social root of religion, and this is the aspect that most of the scientific literature on religion has concentrated on. It's the aspect of religion that involves group behaviors, rituals, the idea that we as a tribe, our group, whatever that is, whether it's a religious denomination or a literal tribe living in the jungle somewhere, our group is God's chosen people. And God wants to protect us and help us in our conflicts with other tribes that we're competing with and fighting against. And they, the outgroup, those are the evil ones. They're somehow less than human. They're worse than human. They're certainly worse than us. And we, however, within our group are all trustworthy because we all believe in the same God, and we all make costly, painful sacrifices to prove to each other that we all believe in this same God. So anthropologists, for example, have talked a lot about this kind of social root God, and it's the kind of God that you see a lot, as you were just saying, in fundamentalist religions of all stripes. But to me, it's fascinating that they're both there. And I think the place where they overlap has to do with something we can see in the brain. I have some kind of indirect evidence that I talk about in the book that there's a part of the brain called the orbitofrontal cortex. It's right above the orbits of the eyes or the eye sockets, the underside of the frontal lobes. It's a very interesting part of the brain. It's involved in reinforcement learning and mother-infant bonding, parental behavior, and it's involved in social behavior, learning to read and interact with the subtle emotional expressions of other people, learning into specific individual people as being threatening or rewarding, attractive or repulsive, whatever. All of that kind of stuff is going on in this part of the brain. And I think the innate model of the mother is sort of the foundation for this. It's not just something that's important for the infant struggling to make contact with mother and survive its helplessness in infancy, but it's also the foundation for learning to interact with all people throughout life, throughout adulthood, to become a social animal. And that overlap in the brain, I think, shows where these two things intersect. But they come from two different selective pressures. One is the selective pressure for infants to survive, their helplessness in childhood and early infancy, and the other comes from the selective pressure for humans to cooperate as a group and to compete successfully against others. So those are the two biological dimensions that I think underlie a lot of the powerful intuitions and emotions behind religion.
So the innate neural model of the mother may persist into adulthood for that reason, because of how it crystallizes around or serves as a foundation for the social pressures that impinge on us to behave and act and survive around other people.
Yes, exactly. That's one of the main reasons I think, or at least that's my main speculation for why this innate model of the mother might persist into adulthood. That, like I briefly mentioned, this orbitofrontal cortex is involved in reinforcement learning, where we learn by trial and error, by discovering that certain things give us punishment or rewards, and social behavior is learned that way. We learn how to get along with other people by doing things that piss them off and discovering, I shouldn't have said that in that particular way. But to do that, to be able to use reinforcement learning for something like that, you need some innate knowledge. You need to be born with some knowledge about what's a good and what's a bad social outcome. You need to be born knowing that a gentle, comforting, friendly voice is rewarding and attractive, or a gentle touch of affection is rewarding and attractive, and a slap in the face is painful and repulsive. Those are kind of extreme examples of what we would call primary reinforcers. You don't need to learn those things. You're born knowing those things. And I think the innate model of the mother can be thought of as partly this collection of primary reinforcers that get us started down the road to learning to be social animals.
That's interesting. That kind of ties in with another story that I read recently, and also with, I was listening to your talk previously, and you talked about a specific type of bird that, where the chicks could actually recognize before anything, and even without the parents being present, the red tip of the beak,
Yes.
and various other aspects of that particular parent figure. And recently there's been a couple of studies which were very, very poorly reported by the Daily Mail, in which they were talking about babies and their kind of racial bias and other biases that they develop or that present themselves within the first 6 months of their lives. The Daily Mail reported it saying basically that babies are racist within 6 months of them being born, which I thought was a bit ridiculous because that's applying a lot of things that are completely relevant to it. But this idea that every animal has a pre-programmed set of reactions to visual and audible stimuli it makes sense, doesn't it? And it's something that you can easily pick up on yourself. How many other studies that you know of have gone into trying to understand how that is formed and whether that is something that is present in all animals or whether it's something that's simply present in mammals? I think I've slightly gone off the rails there because I'm quite tired, but I hope that made sense.
No, it does make sense. Like I mentioned in the talk, that having some kind of innate knowledge is the rule, not the exception. We almost always find some kind of innate knowledge in newly hatched or newly born animals. Now, obviously, the simpler the animal and the simpler the brain, the simpler the knowledge they can possibly have. But it's remarkable that some animals with very small, seemingly small, simple brains like sea turtles have extremely elaborate innate models of the world they hatch out into. Sea turtles hatch out in an underground nest buried in the sand months earlier by their mother. Their mother's long gone by this time, so they're completely on their own. They know that they have to dig their way out of the sand. They know that up is the direction opposite gravity. They know that scraping away sand from above them is what they need to do. Mm-hmm. They know that the temperature of the sand is important. If it's hotter in the sand above them than below them, that it's daytime and that's a bad time to come out. And they'll wait for the sand above to cool down before they'll emerge. And once they get out, they have to find their way to the ocean. They have an innate model of what the ocean looks like and how to find it. It's very simple and it can easily be fooled, but it's under normal natural conditions, it's good enough to get them to the ocean. So there are many fascinating examples of this. And the one you mentioned babies becoming racist by the time they're 6 months. Mm-hmm. That's kind of an extreme way to put it, but I think what they were referring to there, I haven't seen that article you mentioned, but I think what they're probably referring to has to do with face perception, and that's another fascinating example of something where human infants, and this is true of our cousins, the apes and monkeys too, we're born with an innate model of a face, some kind of innate visual understanding of a face. And you can show this in human infants by giving them pairs of visual stimuli to look at. One, a drawing of a face or image of a face, and the other, the same thing, but just rearranged so that it's no longer face-like. It's kind of a scrambled face. And they prefer to look at the natural face rather than the scrambled face. And you can do lots of other experiments like that to show that they have some fairly subtle face perception abilities. I mentioned some of those in my lecture that can be seen online. But one of the things that's interesting about face perception in infants is that they very gradually, in the beginning, they're kind of open to learning just about any kind of face, any color of face or whatever. But as the months and weeks go by, their face perception narrows and they get better at discriminating differences between faces that they're familiar with, faces of their own race, their family members, for example. And they become less capable of discriminating differences in the faces that they haven't seen much of, like other races or other species. So that may be one of the things they're talking about. And
that's definitely what they were talking about. Yeah, they were alluding to the fact that babies become more secure with people who they recognize and facial structures that they recognize, and therefore they were saying that is a form of racism, which I found a bit odd. I think it makes sense to, if you are around a certain set of people long enough and you're used to those particular facial structures, those are the ones that you're going to feel safe with. Anything else is more of an unknown, especially if they're a lot more distinct from the faces that you're used to. So it's not so much racism, it's more of it's what you're used to and what you feel safe around. Another thing that I think of in terms of, when I said previously, I think it's obvious when you see sort of things that are innate within animals. I like microbiology, and there are certain very, very simple traits that protozoa, for example, they know where to go, they know what to eat, they know, they might bump around every now and again, but if you've ever seen a paramecium, for example, flying around and seeing how it gobbles things up and moves around in a dish, that in itself, that has some very basic chemical triggers. And from that very, very basic model, from a single-celled organism going up to, say, ants, which all seem to know their job, they know where to go, they know what leaves to pick up, they know what to bring back to the nest as soon as they're hatched. It's not unrealistic to say that the more you grow in complexity, the more you scale up in terms of the various different things that you can perceive as far as that's concerned. To the point of gods and seeing Jesus in toast and God knows what else.
Yes. And an interesting dimension of this, or aspect of this, is that when an animal is faced with a very subtle, difficult, challenging perceptual task, like, for example, distinguishing two very similar human faces from one another, or distinguishing the meaning behind subtle facial expressions. When we're faced with that kind of task, that's something that we really do need a lot of learning to be able to do, but it's not arbitrary learning. To be able to be really good at it, the brain has some hardwired circuitry that's been shaped through evolution over many generations, going back to our primate ancestors at least, to be very specialized for face perception. We know this for a lot of reasons that we may be able to talk about later. I go into that in some detail in the lecture. But the main idea is that learning of this very difficult, highly specialized kind of learning requires a foundation of innate knowledge. Evolution has shaped certain parts of the brain to be very good at learning to solve this very specific, narrow problem extremely well. And it's so shaped and constrained our learning that you can see the shortcuts it's taken that actually makes it worse at some aspects of this than it would otherwise be if it were just a generalized learning machine. One of the best examples of that has to do with the perception of upside-down faces. We're actually very bad at doing face perception tasks when you turn the faces upside down. Mm-hmm. And that's because the brain is hardwired to expect upright human faces.
There's one question I want to ask. It might relate to this, but see some of the behaviors associated with religious belief. I'm thinking one is, say, like attitudes to gay people. Is this also rooted in this biological thing as well? Or is that more of a social thing that's been tacked onto it?
Well, it's a little of both. But I think what you're tapping into there is a more general question, which is, why is religion obsessed with sex? Period.
Yeah.
Homosexuality is one aspect of that, one very important one, and it's one that most religions have something to say about. But religions are obsessed with sexual behavior of all kinds, and they tend to think of it as something that's bad and has to be restricted in some way. But they also can fly off in other directions too, and we see this in cults especially, that some of them become there are cults where the message of the cult leader is, oh, sex is wonderful, and you should be having sex with as many different people as possible, and especially with me since I'm your cult leader. So why is this? Why this link between sexuality and religion? Why are priests forbidden to have sex? Why are nuns forbidden to have sex? And why do priests go on to molest innocent children at a much higher rate than pedophiles in the general public? So why is this? My answer to that question is a bit indirect and complicated, but the basic idea is that I suggest that if a lot of religion comes from this innate model of the mother, and we as religious people see ourselves as infants, helpless infants, seeking the salvation from this super parent, God, then we have this kind of infantile love for God. We see ourselves as children and God as a parent. But this is happening to us when we grow up and are still religious. This is happening to us as adults in an adult brain, where the attachment system that evolved for mother-infant attachment has been transformed to be used for a new function that happens only in adulthood, and that is adult sexual pair bonding. So now the same circuitry that evolved for mother-infant attachment and that we're using to think about God suddenly has this sexual overtone to it, because now that we're adults, we should be using this love mechanism for finding a mate and forming sexual pair bonds. So now we're projecting these weird kind of sexual feelings towards God, and it just seems creepy. There's something creepy about it. We can't explain it, but it's just, we get these creepy feelings about it, and that comes from the incest avoidance system. This sexual dimension of religion triggers incest avoidance if we see ourselves as having a infant-parent relationship with God. So that's where I think the religious weirdness and obsession with sex comes from.
This kind of interference between the mother image that we have as infants and the sexual pair bonding that we engage in as adults, that kind of interfering of signals also goes a little ways towards possibly explaining why there's role reversal in religion. So religious people revering the infant Jesus or statues of the infant Krishna.
Yes, exactly. The chapter in the book where I talk about this asks the question, is God an evolutionary hack? And what I mean by that is that I'm referring to a line from Francis Crick where he said that God is a hacker, not an engineer. And when he said that, he meant that evolution works by making small changes, not from any kind of grand design. So don't expect the product of evolution to look like it was done by a very clever engineer. You'll see lots of kludges and hacks, lots of ugly things that are the way they are only because of the evolutionary history of the animal. So, for example, in you and me and all vertebrates, our retinas are backwards. The light coming into our eye goes, before it gets to the cells that sense light, it has to go through blood vessels, through nerve fibers, through several layers of neurons, and then finally it gets to the photoreceptors that detect the light. No engineer would make an eye like that. It's a completely ass-backwards way to make a visual system. So why is that? Why are we like that? Not all animals are designed with backwards retinas. The octopuses and squids and cuttlefish, they do it right. They do the obvious, sensible thing. They put the photoreceptors on the side that faces the incoming light. So why do vertebrates have it backwards?
That's interesting because the creationists are always making the argument that the eye is perfect.
Yeah.
So
No, it's not.
Now we've got something to throw back at them, haven't we?
Oh, yes. It's quite the opposite. The vertebrate eye is a great example of stupid design, not intelligent design. But the reason for it has to do with our evolutionary history, that the vertebrate nervous system went through this process of forming a neural tube where the brain and the nervous system kind of invaginated into this hollow tube, and then the eye formed later. And so the eye kind of got turned inside out during this period of invagination, long in our distant evolutionary past, when our ancestors were little more than worms. So anyway, that's a bit of a digression to get back to this point about sex and baby Krishna and all this stuff. The argument I make in this chapter is that this aspect of evolution, this reusing of whatever is there, causes all kinds of awkward, bad design. And one of the awkwardnesses is that when you reuse a circuit like the love mechanism that's important both for mother-infant bonding and for adult sexual pair bonding, you get weird stuff like not only the religious obsession with sex, but you get strange infantile aspects of behavior in adult sexual behavior. So human adult males love to fondle and suckle on female breasts. Where did that come from? That's extremely infantile, strange behavior. But, we don't think of it that way because we just know that, breasts are sexual characteristics and they're sexually exciting, and it's just, well, of course, everybody loves breasts, right? But if you think about it, it's obviously an infantile behavior. And I think it comes in part from the fact that our adult sexual pair bonding was hacked out of a circuit for this infantile attachment. And there's another example like this, and this is what you were getting at, which is that a mother's love for her infant is also hacked out of this same neural circuitry from which we get an infant's longing for its mother. So you can have in an adult brain where an adult is highly religious and is seeing God through this lens of mother-infant attachment, this can very easily flip so that if it's happening in an adult brain, the religious person sees himself as a parent and loves to think of the idea of God as a helpless infant. And thus we get the appeal of the baby Krishna in Hinduism or baby Jesus in Christianity.
There are some pretty fascinating questions that your hypothesis goes at least a little ways in addressing as well, other questions besides the ones we've been talking about. For example, why God is male and not female in most Western religions. I know that a lot of people have, in your talks and in response to you, have brought this up a lot. If your hypothesis is true, why would God not be female in most Western religions instead of male?
Right, and that gets back to what we were talking about earlier, these two biological roots of religion, the social root and the neonatal root. From the social root, we get the punishing, judgmental God who tends to be male in most religions. And that's where I think the maleness of God comes from in Christianity and Islam and Judaism. Although, interestingly, if you look at the sort of official doctrine about that in those religions, God is usually by the religious experts, the theologians in those religions who know the text really well and who sort of state the official position on the gender of God. Most of them will say God is either neutral, or most of them say God has no gender or God has both genders. They're not so keen on the idea of God being male or female as we generally think. But anyway, so I think the maleness of God comes mainly from this social root. But I predict, if my hypothesis is right, that there's also this neonatal root to religion, then it would predict that even in religions where God is seen as predominantly male and judgmental and punishing and rewarding, even when the social root is the dominant theme in the religion, you should see from time to time, maybe in various little subdivisions of religion, of that religion or some offshoot of it or whatever, you should see this neonatal aspect creeping back in. You should see some feminine nurturing aspect of God creeping back in. In the book, I talk about many examples in Islam where Allah is most often thought of and talked about in this judgmental and punishing way. Even there, God is repeatedly referred to in the Quran as beneficent and all-forgiving. So even there, you find this dual nature of God. There's one line I quote in the book. I don't remember exactly how it's phrased, but there's one verse in the Quran where Allah describes himself as the all-merciful, all-benevolent dispenser of painful punishment. So in one sentence, Allah describes himself in these two very contradictory ways.
Well, and even with God being male, for example, in ancient Judaism, there is also something very telling to be said in terms of history as well. For example, the expulsion of the goddess Asherah from ancient Proto-Judaism that eventually gave rise to the male-dominated patriarchal version.
Right. The archaeologists who have studied ancient Hebrew religion through the artifacts that they dig up in ancient Israel have found that there are icons, religious icons from that time, showing both male and female gods together. And they are inscriptions, ancient inscriptions that talk about Yahweh and his consort Asherah. So there was a time when God had a girlfriend or a wife, God being Yahweh, the Abrahamic God. Even he had a wife at one time. And that was pushed out of the religion long ago. But it keeps creeping back in. The Mormons have put it back in. They have a heavenly mother in addition to a heavenly father. The Shakers put it back in. They had their Holy Mother Wisdom, which is kind of a reinterpretation of what the Holy Spirit is. And Mary Baker Eddy's Christian Science, in that religion, in that sect, which is a Christian offshoot, they sing praises to God, our Mother Father, rather than to God, our Heavenly Father. So it keeps creeping back in.
Why do you think there's been, if you look over history, we've gone from polytheism to monotheism, and now it seems like the religions are almost going to deism. It seems they're making their God figure more and more impersonal as it goes along. Do you have any opinions on that?
The only thing I would say about that is that, well, I guess there are several things to say. One is that one interesting idea I've read about polytheism is that it's kind of, it may have been more popular in earlier times because people had so few explanations, such limited understanding of the natural world, that any time anything happened in nature that you didn't understand, you invented a god just for that.
Yeah.
So that's part of it, maybe. But I think the tendency now towards less personal gods, towards a deist god, that may be kind of the other side of that coin. Now that science has explained so many things and so well, there's really less that you need to invoke a god to explain. So some people just don't fight that anymore. They just give into that and say, okay, well, sure, all of the evolution, life, complexity, the human mind, all of that we can account for with biology and evolution. But the universe did have a start. So let's just say that God is the thing, the force, whatever, that did the start, that made the Big Bang, or God maybe is the Big Bang, or maybe God is the universe. You get ideas like that, where God becomes impersonal and more compatible with science. So that kind of a God is more defensible intellectually, but it's also kind of a useless God. It's not a God that answers prayer. Most religious people aren't satisfied with that.
Victor Stenger referred to the sophisticated so-called theologians, the premise keepers. So they keep the premise of a god, but they keep very little else. And Jerry Coyne has said that when a claim is falsified in science, everybody agrees it is bogus. It's discarded, put into the trash bin of bad ideas. But when a claim is falsified in religion, it becomes a metaphor.
Yeah. I think I can agree with that.
I wanted to ask, how would you explain this phenomenon in, say, like the more secular religions, like Buddhism, for example, which doesn't how do you explain that? I don't know how to phrase that better, sorry.
No, that's a great question, and I often get that question.
Yeah.
What about religions that seem not to have any gods? They seem not to have any person who's saving you or punishing you or anything. There's more of a philosophy. At least that's the way it's Buddhism is often described. What I would say about that is that, and I've seen it described in kind of a comical way as that's kind of California Buddhism. that's the kind of Buddhism you get in California, not so much in Asia where Buddhism comes from. If you look at what ethnographers say about how rank and file Buddhists practice their religion in places like the Far East, in Southeast Asia, in China, whatever, in Thailand, you find that even though it is considered theologically incorrect to think of the Buddha as a god, people do it anyway. They want to think of the Buddha as a god. They will pray to the Buddha as if he were a god who was listening to their prayers and could help them with their problems. They will make offerings and sacrifices and seek his presence in holy temples and under sacred
and via
trees.
Avatars as well. Avatars is something that I've been dealing with recently with a particular person who claims to be an avatar of superconsciousness on Earth, Mr. Swami Nithyanandan. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. He leads a cult of some rather bizarre individuals who believe that they can move coconuts with their minds.
Oh, fascinating. I have not heard of that one. But yes, that's exactly the kind of thing I'm talking about. You can find that kind of thing cropping up even in religions that are ostensibly, officially non-theistic. The practitioners, the general faithful out there, want to have something godlike, and they usually invent it.
It also talks a lot to the quite old and quite common Gaia mythology, sort of Mother Earth. This whole feeling of symbiosis with the world around you, I suppose, which is almost always given a feminine sort of outlook. So you have it in Native Americans, you have it in various other tribes that you come across. And you have the modern version, the kind of Gaia version that's gone into folklore and God knows what else. Even Final Fantasy, you have the Gaia concept always shown, the Mother Earth, the living Earth that provides and takes away, and has this whole destructive element to it as well. And it's forceful, it can become angry, but then it's benevolent and it helps the people that help it.
Yes, I'm so glad you brought that up because that's a great example. I think it is very much the same kind of thing. And it's an example of a kind of feeling of God's presence, or this vague other being or source of nurturance or love, which doesn't even have to necessarily project onto a person. It could project onto the earth, onto the environment, onto the world we live in. And when it is projected in that way, it seems to embody the world with a personality, with a mind, with emotions, with love. That's the kind of thing that many people feel that. A lot of people who leave religion because they're just disgusted with fundamentalism or whatever will go on not necessarily to become atheists or agnostics, but many of them describe themselves as spiritual but not religious. Mm-hmm. And a very common form of that is what you just described, a kind of pantheism where you see nature as somehow your creator, and not just a creator, but as having a mind and emotions and love and affection. And I confess to having those feelings myself, even though I know that, the earth has no mind, the universe has no mind. When I'm in the wilderness, I have these sometimes rapt moments when I just feel that, I'm in my element, I'm in a beautiful place, it's warm, it's sunny, the mountains are glorious. I feel almost loved by the earth, or like I belong to the earth. And it's just an emotion that wells up in me. And I think it's coming from this same kind of neural circuit, that the infant in me is expecting to belong to this loving mother. I think there's a close tie there.
That's interesting. I've always, I kind of feel something similar, but I've always rationalized it as being a feeling of freedom, a feeling of actually knowing what's going on around, something more innate than, I live in a city now, and I absolutely loathe living in the city. It's completely unnatural to me. I feel like those sorts of large communities don't make sense to me. Whereas if I'm out at the moment I'm in Scotland next to Loch Long, and we went out for a walk in the mountains today and saw just a handful of people. And that to me it felt more right. It felt more natural to me to be roaming in that sort of fashion. And to me, I always rationalize that as the old, we've not really come that far out of our hunter-gatherer phase, and that's what we evolved to become. And what we are doing now in terms of living in cities, in terms of living in these environments that have been man-made, is actually unnatural. It is actually alien to us. And that's why we feel more in touch with nature when we're out there, rather than these forced constructs that we've created.
Yes. Well, I agree with that too. I think that's part of it. That's a big part of it. And that's what E.O. Wilson talks about when he coined a word for it. He calls it biophilia. Humans evolved in certain kinds of environments, and we respond to them, we're attracted to them, we want to be in nature. And when we destroy nature and replace it with artificial stuff, life just isn't the same anymore. It's degraded in some way. Mm-hmm. So I agree with you completely. That's a big part of it.
In the book's final chapter, you quote the character of Group Captain Lionel Mandrake from Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove. Colonel, I must know what you think has been going on here. Can you provide a brief discussion of why any of this matters, and why is it important to understand the naturalistic origin of religion that reveals the sensed presence of God to be an illusion, and what is ultimately at stake here?
Oh, that's a great question. For those who don't know that movie, that's the quote comes from a great scene near the end of the movie when the world is just on the brink of nuclear war. The American bombers have been sent to bomb the Soviet Union, and the characters are trying to find a way to recall them because it's at stake. There actually isn't a war. No politician ordered the war. So the salvation of the world hangs in the balance of this one phone call. And the person who's trying to place the phone call is being impeded by this sergeant who has this strange view of reality, who doesn't understand how desperate the situation is. He just misses the importance of the situation. And I feel like religion is one of the things that is keeping us from seeing the desperate situation that humanity is in right now. We have something on the order of more than 7 billion people on Earth now. And by the best estimates I've read, that number will likely be in excess of 11 billion by the end of this century, and will still be growing then. It will not have leveled off even then. So we're facing this serious collision with ecological limits on our little planet, and almost no one is talking about it. not in any part of the political spectrum. Our politicians don't want to talk about it. For some reason, it's I don't know whether it's politically incorrect or whatever, but we rarely talk about this. And it's going to be the big thing. I don't know exactly when the crunch will come, but there is a crunch coming when life on this planet will just become very, very unpleasant if we don't get our population growth and our destruction of the natural environment under control. We have to bring our population under control ourselves, because if we let global ecological limits do it for us, that will be much more painful. So that's where we're heading for. And I feel like religion is kind of distracting us from that, because it gets us to think about the world in a completely bizarre, unreal way. Religious people think of, well, it doesn't matter what we do to the environment, because Jesus is going to come back and all of the believers will go off to heaven and everything will be fine. So why worry? That's just Christianity, but you can find it in other religions too. They tend to get us distracted from the real problems we face. So in my final chapter, I talk about what I think are the real problems we need to face and that we're being distracted from. And religion is not the only contributor to this. It's not the only thing. It's not even the worst thing that's contributing to this, but it's one of the things that distracts us from it.
I was going to say there, do you think this, what you describe as the mother kind of complex within religion, is that what drives, talking about population, that nearly a lot of very religious people, they just have the concept of just have loads of children. Do you think that's playing a part in it as well?
There's definitely a connection. I'm not sure which dimension of religion is more contributing to it, but there's definitely a connection between religion and fertility, and it's an empirical one. There's some interesting work done by Bloom, I think, Blume, if I remember correctly. He's in Germany. He's done some interesting sort of statistical correlational studies between degree of religiousness of various religious groups and their fecundity, their birth rates. And you find that families who are more religious in terms of church attendance or whatever tend to have more children than those who are less religious. And this happens even within cultures like Germany that are not particularly religious. You can see it all over the world. And he makes the case, Bloom makes the case, that this is strong evidence for a biological component to religion, that evolution has selected us to have these kinds of beliefs because they improve our reproductive success. That's what evolution cares about, reproductive success. And I think there's something to that. And I think that's mostly happening in the sort of the social dimension of religion. Yeah. But your point is well taken. There is that connection there.
Yeah. I'm wondering, it's just like, we've all had the mother who's desperate for grandchildren. Do they view their God as in that kind of way as well? They need to have more children.
Yeah, I think
sort of model of that behaviour. Yeah,
there may be something to that. Yeah.
Good. I also wanted to ask: is how much of this does this overlap in any way with? I know it's quite a controversial area, evolutionary psychology. Is there any overlap between what you're proposing and evopsych?
Yes.
So I don't know what your opinions are on evopsych, because it seems everyone's got a different view on that.
Yeah, evolutionary psychology is kind of an odd thing. There's quite a lot of it that is, I think, not very well thought out and not very well empirically supported. There's a tendency among evolutionary psychologists to think of some problem, some oddity in human behavior, some puzzle that we don't understand about human behavior, and try to find some way that the behavior is adaptive. They look for they try to find some rationalization, and it often ends up being that, just a rationalization for why gentlemen prefer blondes, for example, is one that I've seen as kind of a joke. But they can go off the deep end. But I don't dismiss all of evolutionary psychologists, because what I'm suggesting here in my book is sort of like that. It's an attempt to see through biological reasoning, through evolutionary reasoning, how humans are susceptible to or prone to religious behavior. So there is a strong overlap. And the place where I think it overlaps most is in what's called the attachment theory of religion. And the sort of developer of that, the founding father of the attachment theory of religion, is a psychologist named Lee Kirkpatrick, very interesting, clever guy who's written some fascinating stuff on this. He's used as his jumping off point for understanding religion the attachment theory of John Bowlby, which is a theory of mother-infant attachment and how that develops during early childhood, and how, if it goes wrong, it affects profoundly the behavior of the child later in life and ultimately an adult. There's a whole lot of empirical research on that, and Lee Kirkpatrick has taken that as a jumping off point for understanding this infantile dimension of religion. So I have a whole chapter on that, my chapter 6, where I try to show how my ideas fit in with his. They actually mesh together very nicely.
What advice would you give to people who are in the process of doubting or questioning their religious faith? And what resources would you recommend for people who need maybe a gentle nudge out of religion to make a transition to rational thought as painless as possible?
Well, that's a very good question. My first suggestion would be, if you're young and in kind of a vulnerable situation, either because of the culture you live in, the country you live in, the family you live in, whatever, you don't have to come out as an atheist or as an agnostic right away. You can reach out to other people who you trust. That sometimes is helpful. There's a great resource online called recoveringfromreligion.org. I strongly recommend that website. There are great resources there. You can find deconversion stories on the internet. One of my favorite places to go for those is Daylight Atheism, which is a blog run by Adam Lee, and he has on his site several collections of essays and stories people have written about their deconversion experiences. Just reading about what other people have gone through in the deconversion process is very helpful. And most of all, I would say, if you're on the fence, if you're struggling with belief, if you're having a crisis of faith, I would just say that it's the struggle that's the hard part. It's getting over the fence that's the hard part. If you make it over the fence, life as a non-believer is actually pretty good. It's not as scary as the religious people make it out to be. And in fact, it can be liberating and exhilarating. You have a different outlook on life. You no longer think that you're going to live forever with Jesus in heaven or whatever. You won't be reunited with your deceased loved ones, but you find ways of coping with that. There's an upside to it, too. There's a plus side to it, too. You're no longer always struggling against all the contradictions in your religious dogma. You're no longer having to rationalize away why God hasn't answered your prayers. You can now face reality more honestly. And there's something to be said for that.
And when you realize that this is the only life that you've got, you sometimes enjoy it a lot more. I've heard from people who've deconverted, or rather become atheists from being religious. It's not something I did myself, so I can't understand it. I feel kind of left out of that club in a lot of ways. But a lot of people have said that they felt a whole new freedom as a result of leaving their religion, because they finally realized that this is the only life that they had to live, and they started living it properly without the restrictions.
Yes, but one of my online atheist friends, Greta Christina, had put it very beautifully. I'll have to paraphrase her because I don't remember the exact way she put it. But she said, if I knew I was going to live for eternity, for trillions and trillions of years, endless life, I'd just sit on the couch and watch TV all the time. because if there was something I felt I wanted to do and needed to do, there'd be another century, another millennium, another trillion years where I could do that eventually. So why worry? But if you know your life is limited and finite and precious, then you're more likely to get up and do something important with it.
Well, I am in that camp of former believer turned atheist myself, so that speaks a lot to me, and I've told my story before on other podcasts. I really appreciate you giving that advice. That was our show for today. Thank you for listening. If you enjoy listening to us, consider leaving us a review on iTunes or on whatever other platform you listen to us on. And if you love the show, consider becoming a patron through our Patreon account. For as little as $5 per episode, you get early access to shows before they get posted publicly, and you get to come on Google Hangouts with us. And we are also working on providing exclusive content that you won't get anywhere else.
Yeah, just to reiterate again, we're very sorry we have been a bit lax with our Patreon rewards, and we're really deeply sorry. That's all our own doing. But we are going to get back onto that immediately.
Many thanks to our two current patrons, Microbloganism and Josh at the Society for the Advancement of Science. We appreciate your support, and their YouTube channels will be linked below. And before we sign off, I would like to give my good friend Melanie Rice and her Normalize Atheism campaign a shout out. This campaign is about encouraging atheists, secularists, and skeptics to become more open about their unbelief in society in a non-confrontational way that helps break down the misconceptions many people hold about non-believers and helps bring us out of the margins and into more visibility. Check out normalizeatheism.com for more details on that. And next episode, we'll be speaking with Phil Ferguson of skepticmoney.com and The Phil Ferguson Show to talk what I like to call skeptonomics. We'll be talking about economics and the role skepticism and critical thinking can be applied to understanding economics. And with that, I think that's all the details I need to get out of the way. Thank you, Dr. John Wathey, for joining us. It's been our pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you very much. It's been an honor and a pleasure for me. I really appreciate the invitation. I just wanted to thank you for your great questions. For all of you, I had great questions. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. It's been fantastic.
And how are you guys doing?
I'm doing fantastic.
I'm pretty sleepy. I've climbed a mountain today, so I'm pretty knackered, but good. Very good.
Nice. Well, today we are thrilled to be joined by Dr. John C. Wathey. Dr. Wathey is a computational biologist with special research interests in evolutionary algorithms, protein folding, and neuroethology. From 91 to 95, Dr. Wathey served as senior applications scientist at Biosim Technologies, a company that develops molecular modeling software for the pharmaceutical industry. In 96, he founded his own company, Wathey Research, and most of his scientific research there has been funded by grants from the National Institutes of Health. He is the author of a book that came out last year called The Illusion of God's Presence, The Biological Origins of Spiritual Longing, and he joins us on the show to discuss the questions raised in this book about what our evolutionary heritage can teach us about the nature of religious belief. Welcome to the show, Dr. Wathey.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure and an honor.
To kick things off, can you tell us a little about where you're coming from as far as your research interests go and what prompted you to write this book?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I did my PhD at UC way into the brain to try to figure out how the brain is solving this problem, if you know what the problem is to begin with. So that's where I come from. That's my background. And when I was in Ted's lab many years ago, this was 30s, some odd years ago now. It really kind of changed the way I thought about all living things, not just experimental animals, but humans too. And I began to see human religious behavior through this lens of neuroethology. I could see something in religion that I thought most of the scientific literature on religion had been ignoring. And I started to fantasize about writing a book about it someday. And it wasn't until many years later that I finally actually sat down and wrote the book. But that's where it came from. That's how I got this thing forming in my brain that I eventually had to put out into the form of a book.
When I first heard the topic, it's a bit of that there's a biological underpinning to religious belief, if I'm picking you up right, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, so what are you basing this on? I'm very curious. This is something I've never heard before.
Yeah, I'm actually surprised how many people have not heard it and how many people kind of push back against it a little bit. Some people, and it's not just religious people who push back against it. I've had some pushback from scientists, skeptics, or humanists even. There's a very common perception that religion comes entirely from indoctrination. It's a cultural thing. We know, for example, that a person's religious denomination is almost entirely predicted or highly predicted by the religious denomination of their parents. So all of this strongly suggests that there's a big component of learning, culture, and indoctrination in religion. So how can this be biological? But there are two big lines of evidence that say that there is something biological going on here. One is just the obvious fact that religion is a cultural universal. Every human culture has something that most of us would recognize as religion or sort of proto-religion. And the other line of evidence comes from twin studies. If religion came only from environment and learning and indoctrination, then we would expect that pairs of identical twins would be no more alike in their religiousness than are pairs of fraternal twins. Fraternal twins have half of their genes in common. Identical twins have 100% of their genes in common. But that shouldn't make any difference. San Diego, in the lab of Ted Bullock, who is he's considered one of the founding fathers of neuroethology. And ethology, as some of your listeners will probably already know, is the study of animal behavior in its natural context. Ethologists are mainly interested in things like how does the behavior evolve, how does it contribute to an animal's reproductive success. And they often look at behaviors that occur in newly hatched or newly born animals where there's not been a whole lot of time for learning, and that's where you're most likely to see something where evolution has shaped the behavior. So that's ethology. Neuroethology is a branch of neuroscience where we're trying to understand how some particular circuit in the brain works. And it's easiest to do that if you can find an animal that's highly specialized for one peculiar, unusual behavior. For example, things like infrared vision in rattlesnakes, or the electric sense in nucleoelectric fish, or song learning in birds. All of those things are highly specialized, and they're the kinds of things you can easily measure in the laboratory. It's pretty obvious what problem the animal is trying to solve. So that gives you a nice...
Colonel, I must know what you think has been going on here.
Life as a non-believer is actually pretty good. It's not as scary as the religious people make it out to be. And in fact, it can be liberating and exhilarating. You have a different outlook on life. You no longer think that you're going to live forever with Jesus in heaven or whatever. You won't be reunited with your deceased loved ones, but you find ways of coping with that. There's an upside to it, too. You're no longer always struggling against all the contradictions in your religious dogma. You're no longer having to rationalize away why God hasn't answered your prayers. You can now face reality more honestly.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Trolling with Logic, where we bring the hammer down on pseudoscience, ignorance, and unreason on a bi-weekly basis. I am your host, Nathan Dickey, and with me, as always, are co-hosts Cal and Jen.